This is South Korea. They account for nearly 30% of the global shipbuilding market, only behind China, a superpower country with a population 27 times larger than it. They simply dominate in quantity, but South Korea is winning a different measurement: quality. 75% of every liquid natural gas carrier currently sailing the ocean was built in South Korea. 93% of new liquid petroleum gas carrier orders go to Korean yards. They own the most complex ships to build that represent the future of shipping. But how did they do this? How did a middle power country that was poorer than most African countries not even a century ago become so incredible at building ships? Well, to understand that, we need to go back a few decades. The year was 1961. 8 years after the Korean War ended. South Korea was still recovering from the total devastation that the war caused. Over 1 million casualties, 600,000 homes destroyed, 44% of factories in ruins, among many other industries. It was one of the poorest countries on earth, with a per capita GDP of less than $100, lower than Guatemala's and even Chad or Cameroon's. North Korea was nearly a third richer at the time. The country had no heavy industry, no domestic arms production, and almost no way to defend itself without American troops stationed on the peninsula. And those American troops were eventually going to leave. See, in 1969, President Richard Nixon announced the Nixon Doctrine, a policy shift signaling that the US would no longer provide direct military support to allies in the Asia-Pacific because of the drain from the Vietnam War. 2 years later, he withdrew the US 7th Infantry Division from South Korea, roughly a third of all American forces there, without fully consulting Seoul. For then-President Park Chung-hee, the military strongman who'd seized power in a 1961 coup, the message was unmistakable. Korea couldn't rely on anyone else for its survival. But without heavy industry, it couldn't build the weapons it needed. And without weapons, it wouldn't survive. So Park made a bet that almost everyone told him was insane. On January 12, 1973, he announced the Heavy and Chemical Industry Drive, or HCI Drive for short, targeting 6 strategic sectors: steel, non-ferrous metals, shipbuilding, machinery, electronics, and petrochemicals. The goal was to transform South Korea from a poor agricultural economy into an industrial power within a single decade. Every international institution thought this was reckless. The World Bank had already blocked Korea's proposed steel mill back in 1969, declaring the country had no comparative advantage in producing steel. The International Monetary Fund refused financing. The US Agency for International Development and the US Export-Import Bank refused financing. Even Korean economists objected, but Park overrode them all. He could do this because the Yushin Constitution of 1972 had suspended democracy and concentrated all executive power in his hands. The state directed 50% of all domestic credit into subsidized policy loans, at interest rates 5 percentage points below market. It granted massive tax exemptions and up to 100% import duty waivers for targeted industries. And critically, the Korean government declared that any oil delivered to Korea had to travel on Korean-built ships, essentially guaranteeing demand for a shipbuilding industry that barely existed. And there was another force pushing Korea toward shipbuilding beyond commerce. In the 1970s, sea-based North Korean military provocations compelled South Korea to develop its own sea power, leading to the patrol boat acquisition and domestic building policy, the beginning of Korea's indigenous warship building industry, a strategic priority that's still supported by current defense strategy. But building an industry from nothing takes more than policy. It takes someone willing to start before anyone believes it's possible. And Chung Ju-young didn't wait for the government's formal announcement. Chung was the founder of Hyundai. Born in 1915 to a poor farming family in what's now North Korea, he'd only had an elementary school education. But by the early 1970s, he'd built Hyundai into one of Korea's major construction companies, and he wanted to build ships. There was just one problem though: nobody would give him the money. Banks in the US rejected him, and banks in Japan rejected him, so he flew to London. What happened next was one of the most audacious moments in industrial history. In 1971, Chung met with Charles Longbottom, chairman of British ship consultancy firm A&P Appledore. During their discussion, it said he pulled out a 501 banknote from his pocket and pointed to the image printed on it, the Jeobuksun, a 16th century Korean warship famous for its armored shell, and told Longbottom, Our ancestors built this ironclad turtle ship in the 16th century, 300 years before Britain started using iron in ships. Somehow, this patriotism worked, and Longbottom wrote a letter of recommendation to Barclays Bank, which agreed to provide a $43 million loan, contingent on Chung securing a buyer first. So Chung flew to Switzerland, met a Greek shipping tycoon named George Livanos, and sold him 2 massive 260,000-ton tankers. He showed Livanos photographs of the proposed shipyard site, an empty sand beach in Mipo Bay in Ulsan, along with ship plans. The terms of the order were unfavorable because of the massive risk involved. They'd have to make ships 16% cheaper than market rate. And if they fail to fulfill the contract properly, they will reimburse the principal and interest in full. And then he built both at the same time. Construction on the Ulsan shipyard began on March 23, 1972, months before the HCI drive was even formally announced. Chung simultaneously built the yard and the first ships, an approach that was basically unprecedented in shipbuilding history. Korean workers had been sent to shipyards in Scotland to observe techniques, learn the craft, and bring that knowledge home. On June 28, 1974, Hyundai delivered its first vessel, the Atlantic Baron, a 260,000-ton tanker, just 2 years and 3 months after breaking ground. And the results of the broader HCI drive were staggering. According to a 2024 study in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, targeted industries saw a 128% increase in output compared to non-targeted ones between 1973 and 1986. Exports from targeted sectors increased roughly 28% annually through most of the 1970s, and by 1983, heavy and chemical industries accounted for over 50% of Korea's total exports, beating the original 1980 target ahead of schedule. Now here's the number that puts it all into perspective. South Korea's shipbuilding production in 1975 was less than a sixth of West Germany's. By 1990, its output was larger than all European yards combined. And Hyundai Heavy Industries had become the world's largest shipbuilder by 1983, just 10 years after building its first ship. But as with all stories of extreme growth, the inevitable fall came hard. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis, a cascading currency and debt collapse that swept across East and Southeast Asia, hit Korea with devastating force. The International Monetary Fund delivered a $58 billion bailout. 11 of the top 30 chaebol, Korea's massive family-run conglomerates, went bankrupt. And then came the biggest collapse of all. Daewoo, Korea's second-largest conglomerate, buckled under $57 billion in debt, the largest corporate bankruptcy in Korean history. Daewoo Shipbuilding was separated from the wreckage and taken over by the state-owned Korea Development Bank. Smaller yards shut down across the country. But the thing is though, this crisis didn't destroy Korean shipbuilding, it transformed it. The weakest yards closed. The survivors were forced to consolidate, restructure, and specialize. The industry that walked out of 1997 was leaner, more focused, and preparing, without fully knowing it, to make the next bet. Now, to understand that bet, you need to understand the competitive landscape Korea was facing. Japan had dominated global shipbuilding since the 1950s, holding roughly half the world market for decades, until Korea overtook Japan's share in 1999 due to its lower labor cost. But then China entered the picture, with state subsidies on a scale nobody could match. More than $90 billion since 2002, according to a Rand Corporation analysis. Labor costs roughly 50% cheaper than Korea's, the world's cheapest steel, and prices running 10 to 15% below Korean equivalents. By 2010, China had surpassed Korea in total volume. By the 2020s, China controlled the majority of global orders, completions, and backlogs. If you measured shipbuilding by tonnage alone, China won decisively. So what did Korea do? Well, it refused to fight the volume war. Instead of competing on bulk carriers and standard container ships, where China's cost advantages were insurmountable, Korea moved upmarket. Liquefied natural gas carriers, or LNG carriers for short, very large crude carriers, or VLCCs for short, liquefied petroleum gas carriers, or LPG carriers for short, and ammonia carriers. These vessels are the hardest to build, the most expensive to buy, and the most unforgiving of error. Call it the complexity premium. Korea didn't just drift into this position. It deliberately seeded the bottom of the market and concentrated on segments where engineering precision, systems integration, and decades of accumulated know-how created barriers China couldn't simply spend its way past. And the numbers show that it worked. South Korea holds roughly 20 to 28% of global shipbuilding market share, second behind China, but it commands approximately 70% of global orders for large LNG carriers and dominates VLCCs, the most technically demanding and highest value commercial vessels on Earth. 2/3 of the entire global LNG fleet in service was built in South Korea. The country also holds about 93% of the global LPG carrier market. But why can't China just catch up? Well, because an LNG carrier has to safely transport liquefied natural gas at -260 degrees Fahrenheit. The containment systems, insulation, high-pressure pipelines, and reliquefaction units make these ships comparable in component count to aircraft carriers. This isn't about cheap labor. Labor is only about 5 to 7% of a large ship's total price. It's about systems integration, precision welding, containment technology mastery, and a workforce whose average tenure at places like HD Hyundai's Ulsan facility is about 16 years. It doesn't hurt that South Korea has both the world's largest and second largest integrated steel mills, Gwangyang and Pohang, both owned by POSCO, supplying the shipyards with some of the cheapest and highest quality steel in the democratic world. Not to mention, Chinese-built LNG carriers have had notable reliability issues, from generator failures to propulsion problems. China's most advanced vessels still contain only about 30 to 40% domestically produced components, with the rest sourced from Korea, Europe, and Japan. In 2025 alone, South Korean exports of ship engines and components to China totaled $1.29 billion. They don't just build LNG carriers. They supply the critical parts to the yards trying to compete with them. The three companies executing the strategy are HD Hyundai, the successor to the shipyard Chungju Yongbult, now the world's largest shipbuilding company by individual capacity and still operating from the largest shipyard in Ulsan, Samsung Heavy Industries, and Hanwha Ocean, which was Daewoo Shipbuilding before Hanwha Group acquired it in 2023. Together, Korea's big three saw their combined operating profit surge 170% from 2024 to 2025, with order backlogs stretching through 2028, and the demands only growing, especially after the Russia-Ukraine war beginning in 2022 sent Europe scrambling for LNG alternatives, pushing carrier orders even higher. But here's the thing. The commercial complexity premium, while still very real, isn't permanent. Chinese yards have dramatically shortened LNG construction timelines. Korea may only stay ahead for another 2 or 3 years in some segments. If the story ended here, it'd be a cautionary tale about a lead that's slowly evaporating. But Korea's making a third bet. On the commercial frontier, Korea's already designing the next generation of the very vessel it dominates. Samsung Heavy Industries and the Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute are developing the world's first nuclear-powered LNG carrier. It's powered by a 100-megawatt molten salt reactor that runs for the ship's entire service life without a single fuel change. But more interestingly, they're now leaning into military exports as the next expression of the complexity premium. South Korea's defense exports hit $15.4 billion in 2025, a 60% year-on-year surge, with weapon systems selling across Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. But naval exports are where the shipbuilding story converges with the geopolitical one, and this is where it gets really interesting. In November 2024, South Korea commissioned the ROKS Jeongjo the Great, an Aegis-equipped destroyer fitted with advanced interceptor missiles and modern radar systems. The contract was awarded in October 2019, and the ship was delivered about 5 years later at a cost of approximately $565 million. Now compare that to the closest American equivalent, the DDG-51 Flight 3 Aegis destroyer. That costs over $2.5 billion per ship and takes roughly 9 years to build. Same class of capability for nearly 20% of the price, and about half the time. That isn't some minor difference. It's an incredible structural advantage with massive geopolitical implications. And America's own shipbuilding collapse makes this even more critical. The US hasn't launched an LNG carrier since 1980. Its share of global commercial shipbuilding fell to 0.04% in 2024. Meanwhile, China's Navy has already surpassed the US Navy in total hull count, and according to a Rand Corporation analysis, is building warships 5 times faster. America desperately needs ships. Its yards can't deliver them fast enough or cheaply enough. So enter South Korea, Under what's been called the Make American Shipbuilding Great Again initiative, Korean shipbuilders are setting up operations inside the United States. Hanwha Ocean acquired Philly Shipyard for $100 million in December 2024, with plans to expand capacity from 1.5 ships to 10 per year by 2035. In October 2025, Huntington Ingalls signed a memorandum of agreement with HD Hyundai to jointly design and build the US Navy's next-generation logistics support vessels, the first collaboration of its kind between the two countries. The country also announced plans for a $150 billion shipbuilding fund as part of a broader investment package in the US, including building American shipyards, training American workers, and opening what they're calling Masters Academies to transfer shipbuilding expertise. Korea isn't just selling ships anymore. It's selling the ability to build naval power affordably and quickly, at the exact moment when the US can barely build ships at all, and China's naval expansion is alarming every Pacific and Atlantic ally. The complexity premium has jumped from a commercial strategy to a geopolitical asset. Korea's exporting not just products, but entire ecosystems of technology, production, and maintenance. And that's the thread that connects all of this. At every inflection point over the past 50 years, Korea made the harder bet. In the 1970s, when every international institution said don't build ships, they built the shipyard and the first ship at the same time. In 1997, when the crisis nearly wiped out the industry, the survivors didn't retreat to low-end production. They climbed toward the most technically demanding vessels on Earth. And now, as China closes the commercial gap, Korea isn't trying to outproduce them. It's leaning into military exports and strategic partnerships that turn engineering mastery into geopolitical leverage no one else can offer. It all started with a man holding up a banknote on an empty beach. It's now reshaping alliances across the Pacific. Thank you for watching.